Oklahoma is the land of second chances. Who were the people that made it so? We'll dig for the golden threads they've woven through Oklahoma history. The Red River Institute is proud to present Oklahoma Gold. I'm Gwin Faulconer-Lippert, along with award-winning author and Southern Nazarene University historian John J. Dwyer. We'll find the golden nuggets of Oklahoma history here now. Oklahoma Gold. OU's first African-American football pioneer. John J. Dwyer, tell me his story.
Well, let's just say this would have been maybe among the least likely people that you would ever expect to become not only one of the greatest Oklahoma Sooner football players in history, but the first African-American to succeed in Oklahoma football. And I say to succeed because there were four young men that tried out for the team. We're talking now the mid-1950s, and did not make it the year before Prentice Gautt came on campus. Why do we say the least likely? Well, of course, the obvious answer to that is it was a time of segregation where up to that point, OU and most other colleges in America to a certain point, and by the 50s still in most of the southern and border states, were off limits to black students. Now, OU had gotten their first African-American students a few years earlier, Ada Lois Sippiel Fisher, George McLaurin. We're familiar with some of those names, but not on the athletic field. And this young man...
We had students before we had athletes?
Yeah, it kind of goes against President George Lynn Cross at the time of OU saying that he wanted to build a university that the football team could be proud of. So,
is that a true quote?
That is actually a true quote.
Okay,
yeah.
good.
And I believe he actually said that in a board meeting. Might have been a faculty meeting, but it was certainly a meeting in which I think he was trying to get more budget passed for the academic part of the school.
So what position did Prentice Gautt play?
Well, Prentice Gautt was a running back. He was actually a fullback, although he kind of, in modern parlance, we would say he moved around different positions, but he was basically a big, strong, and fast fullback. But this was a boy that started out a frightened little, the term of the time would be Negro boy, that was dropped off at an orphanage when he was, I don't know, 4, maybe 5 years old. His mother, who had mostly cared for him, had passed away. His father took him to an orphanage. And I found this out years ago when I had a very precious interview with his first wife, Deidre. She told me this story about how he recalled, and it gets you choked up to even think about this little boy walking into this orphanage, scared to death, with his little suitcase in his hand, all by himself. Well, there's a couple things that his dad did for him, though. He helped pass along a strong, strapping, big physical stature, and he also got married again to a woman who was good as gold, became the second Mrs. Gautt, Prentice Gautt's stepmother, Sarah Gautt, who's a name, an Oklahoma hero that we should remember. And she saw to it that they went back to that orphanage and got Prentice out of there and brought him home to live with them. Now, many of y'all listening right now know about the Deep Deuce, the classic African-American district of the heyday in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. Count Basie, Duke Ellington, Charlie Christian, Jimmy Rushing, others that played there, Zelia Page Bro, F.D. Moon, and others that educated there, great business people there. Well, Prentice Gautt grew up in the literal shadows of the Deep Deuce back in its heyday in a small house, and in fact, as those places are not all good and not all bad, there were many shining, memorable, historic things about the Deep Deuce, but it also had its rough side. And he remembered when he was a boy, the sounds of broken bottles and fights going on in alleys just feet away from his house. But Sarah Gautt, brave hero of Oklahoma history, a woman of broken health at an early age, did what it took to raise a young man that by the time of his senior year at Oklahoma City Douglas High School was not only the person that legendary OU football coach Bud Wilkinson said was the best player in the state of Oklahoma, but he was a champion scholar. He was on virtually every type of academic, social, and other all-star group in Oklahoma at a time that still was Jim Crow segregation for the most part. In the we're talking the mid-1950s. He graduated from Douglas in 1956. A couple of memorable scenes before we catch our breath here in a moment, Gwin. In 1952, when Prentice was about ninth grade, he was downtown in the Skirvin Hotel, and it's still heyday. That's where Bud Wilkinson had the Sooners would stay the night before their home games. And Prentice Gautt went over to see if he could spot him. He comes face to face with that year's Heisman Trophy winner, Billy Vessels. Billy Vessels said words Prentice Gautt would never forget. "By gosh, young man, you look like you should be playing for us right now." And Prentice Gautt, who Billy Vessels was his hero, and probably most Oklahoma boys at that time, he said, "Well, I hope to someday, Mr. Vessels, sir. I really hope to someday."
What a story.
Well, it was a story, and Prentice remembered that he could barely feel the sidewalk as he ran all the way home to tell all his friends in the neighborhood he had met Billy Vessels. Now, most of us today probably haven't heard of Billy Vessels. Well, again, he was OU's first Heisman Trophy winner. There was a game that year that was on TV where Oklahoma and Notre Dame in that fabled rivalry took on each other. It was at Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. This was the first game of any sport ever telecast in living color on TV. OU and Notre Dame, 1952. It was also the first game that had any instant replays. It was also the game where an Oklahoma team that was somewhat overmatched nearly beat one of the greatest Notre Dame teams in history because a guy named Billy Vessels ran all over the field that day. Notre Dame never stopped him, ran for 3 touchdowns, 200 yards, which back then, that'd be like probably 400 yards today running for a game. But that was the guy that Prentice Gautt met. He determined that he was going to be that guy someday. Well, wasn't maybe a year or so later, he and his buddies get their way down to Norman, and they go out on the field at OU.
Are they high school kids?
They're high school kids, and they were African-American kids at a time when there were still just maybe a handful of students at OU. They get out on the field through an open gate or climbed a fence or something, and they're running all over the field, imaginary touchdowns, playing like they're Billy Vessels, and then a maintenance man hollers, calls them the N-word, of course, said, "You boys need to get out of here.
Get off this field."
So Prentice, he goes, "Yes, sir," and he runs, but as he's hopping back over the fence, he looks back and he says, "But I intend to come back here someday and play on this field."
Now that's Oklahoma gold. We'll have the golden thread. Do you know what it is? Oklahoma Gold, dignifying our history by telling our stories. The golden thread, it's the golden thread that stitches the past to Oklahoma's present. Okay, let me see if I have the clues right, John J. Dwyer. This is an African-American football pioneer at the University of Oklahoma. He was a fullback. He was an orphan in his young life, and he graduated from Douglas High School.
That's right here in Oklahoma City. And, we've been talking about this great OU football pioneer and all. Probably some people out there, at least Sooner fans, the Cowboy fans may not be caring, but Sooner fans are like, well, what did he do there? Okay, we've talked about he went there, but what did he accomplish? Well, what he did was he started out, as we said, there had been a handful of other African-American young men that had tried to make the team the year before, one of whom was the grandson of one of OU's star defensive backs a couple of years ago. Now, of course, I'm forgetting the name. Those of you out there, it was Stephen Parker that ran a fumble back for a touchdown in the Orange Bowl against Georgia. Great player. His grandfather was one of those that tried out for the team, did not make it, certainly had social obstacles in the way, and people weren't rooting for those guys. Prentice Gautt came in. Everybody knew he was a great player. He was the most valuable player in the All-State game, the fall of 1955. That was black and white players. His team, Douglas, had played against Capitol Hill in the first integrated, well, maybe we'll do a Oklahoma Gold on that game sometime, first integrated high school football game in Oklahoma history. And Prentice Gautt had shined in that game. Well, he gets to OU, struggles. In fact, the second year, Bud Wilkinson tells him, hey, you know, the way you're going right now, you're not even going to make our team. And that was his second year after his freshman year. Well, there were some guys, there were obviously some opposition to him socially. There were certain players on the team that were not thrilled to have a black young man on their team. I'm sure that had been passed down to them from elders. But there were guys whose names I think deserve to be mentioned that stood up. And we would say today, well, of course they should have stood up. That'd be the thing we do. Well, yeah, we maybe do that today, but in the 1950s, you could lose friends. You could lose girlfriends. You could lose businesses if you were white and you stood up for an African American. There was a man named Brewster Hobby who was Prentice Gaught's classmate, teammate, and fellow running back. And Brewster Hobby was the only player, the only high school player in Oklahoma history that was Player of the Year in Oklahoma as a high school senior in both football and baseball. So when Brewster Hobby stood up and said, I want a room with Prentice Gautt on the road, when sometimes they would go to places that wouldn't even allow African Americans in their hotels, okay? Brewster Hobby said, well, if you're going to have me, if you're going to have me, you're going to have Prentice. And so Brewster Hobby's example, Jakey Sandifer was another player. There were a number of players that Prentice remembered in his later years really stood up for him. Stephen Parker, by the way, that was the name of the great OU player a few years ago whose grandfather had tried in the 1950s. And Parker put on his, the younger Parker put on his back of his uniform, Parker 3 in homage to his grandfather who had tried, who no doubt would have made it a couple of generations later. Well, Prentice Gautt, the OU football team as freshmen, they were not served. A restaurant in Tulsa refused to serve them because they had one black player with them. The entire freshman OU team got up and walked out of that restaurant, refused to eat there. Prentice Gautt goes on to become not just a letterman and a decent player, but two-time All-Big Eight, led OU to 2 straight Big Eight football championships, 2 straight Orange Bowl victories, and was Player of the Year in the Big Eight Conference. Academic All-American, went on to become a National Football League player with the St. Louis Cardinals and Cleveland Browns for 7 years. Maybe one of the things Sarah Gautt, that precious, valorous stepmother that raised him, would have been most proud of was that today the Prentice Gautt Academic Center, that's the name of it, in the athletic portion of the University of Oklahoma campus. It's named after Prentice Gautt. But I know you're wanting to know, okay, John, what is the golden thread that ties this all together? Here was a young man, he's an African American, he was orphan, first player that made it at OU as an African American, came from Oklahoma City. There was a group called Medifar, men like G.E. Tarver, Frank Cox, Charles Tollett Sr., whose son, Charles Tollett Jr., I went to grade school with at Millwood. These men in the medical profession, African Americans in the 50s, dentists, doctors, they put together the money to pay for Prentice Gaught's scholarship, academic, to OU the first year because Bud Wilkinson said, if you will get him on campus, I will see to it he succeeds. George Lynn Cross, the president, fighting the tide winds of political opposition, couldn't let him come in as a football scholarship athlete. The deal was if you make the team the second year, Bud Wilkinson said, we'll give you a scholarship. And the rest, as they say,
is Oklahoma Gold.